Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhno. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of August the 5th. So please join. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and leave your comments just below the video. Let's begin.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
We will now summarize the past day, and I will start with an extremely pleasant event that, in my opinion, took place the day before. So the Security Service of Ukraine announced that yesterday it struck 5 Russian Federation fighter jets with drones at the Saky airfield. One of the fighter jets was completely destroyed. Where is the Saky airfield located? Let me remind everyone who may have forgotten the map. So this is Crimea. This is the occupied territory of the Crimean Peninsula, and the Saky airfield is located southeast of Yevpatoria, north of Sevastopol, in the settlement of Novofedorivka. And the most interesting and obvious question is, why is this strike happening here specifically? First of all, let's figure out what was hit and what was destroyed. According to the Security Service of Ukraine, one SU-30 SM aircraft was completely destroyed by fire. 2 more aircraft of the same model and modification were damaged. And another 2 Su-24 bombers were also attacked by drones. So 5 aircraft were damaged and 1 was completely destroyed. Why did this happen, and why did it happen here, and why did it happen now? I have my own theory as to why this is happening. Because the Saky airfield, quite logically, is a direction from which the Russians can launch attacks on our temporarily occupied, more precisely from the temporarily occupied territory against Kherson, which is under our government's control. And in fact, this is exactly what we observed the day before. I'll show this video again where the Kherson Regional Military Administration demonstrated the strike on the Kherson Bridge, the Ostrivsky Bridge, which leads to the southernmost district of the city of Kherson, to the Korabelnyi district, or, as locals simply call it, Ostriv, because it really is an area in Kherson that is surrounded by water on all sides. And accordingly, there is only one bridge that leads to these locations. Let's go over it again. Let's take another look at the layout of the districts in Kherson. The Korabel district, specifically the Korabelnyi district, which is a significant part of the city of Kherson, is being discussed. Well, this is how it looks if you highlight it. This is how it is visualized. This is across the Koshova River. The bridge runs through these areas here. It was specifically at this point that the strike on the bridge occurred, which I just showed in the video. And nothing but aviation could have carried out such a strike. Moreover, what we saw in that video was specifically airstrikes. That is, cabs launched by Russian fighter jets, and it is highly likely that this was carried out from the area of the Saky airfield in temporarily occupied Crimea. That is why, at the very least, as an eye for an eye, and at most because of the continued Russian bombardment of this area and this specific bridge, the security service carried out such a special operation. Why is it necessary to at least postpone it now? Because it is very important to document this. It is impossible to destroy all Russian aircraft. It is impossible to make the Russians stop bombing Kherson. But it is possible to buy some time. It is possible to gain some time and, as much as circumstances allow, carry out a proper evacuation of the population. Because right now, in the Korabelnyi district, there is essentially a blockade of the population. This is an island, friends, which is connected to the main part of Kherson by a bridge. There are people with limited mobility here. There are people in wheelchairs. In the worst case scenario, if the bridge is destroyed, people will have to swim across. And in this direction, the enemy is very close. The enemy is already right here. They're positioned on the other bank of the Dnipro, and they're shelling this district. In fact, the enemy is also present on these islands here. From time to time, they appear here more precisely. They come here across the Konka River from Oleshki. These island skirmishes are ongoing, and the enemy is shelling the territory of the Korabelnyi district of Kherson from here, essentially conducting a safari on civilians. And this creates a very difficult humanitarian situation. The Russians are causing us many problems in terms of humanitarian disasters that directly affect the civilian population. And this is a major problem. At the very least, postponing this problem with the possibility of carrying out a more or less proper evacuation as much as possible is important. By the way, it's worth noting that the evacuation from the Korabelnyi district has been ongoing the entire time, almost since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. But now it has become extremely urgent and relevant because the Russians destroyed the bridge. And in fact, I'll repeat once more, the complete destruction of this bridge, and the Russians are announcing further strikes on it, will essentially block any movement. And we're not just talking about military logistics here. We're talking primarily about civilian logistics. Accordingly, this operation on the Crimean Peninsula with the strike on aircraft at the Saky airfield is at least capable of delaying this process somewhat. Another process worth mentioning, which the General Staff highlighted yesterday, concerns our influence and the creation of problems for the Russians in Sochi. Because the General Staff of the Armed Forces reported yesterday that a significant and impactful strike was successfully carried out on the crucial aviation infrastructure of this particular airfield, which is located in this specific city near the well-known resort of Sochi, very close to the district of Adler. The fact is, lately we have also been creating a lot of problems for the Russians, but, well, I would say these are quite proper and legitimate problems. When our mosquito drones fly over Moscow airfields, or basically in the Moscow region, passenger traffic stops in absolutely all directions. Passenger traffic at Domodedovo comes to a halt. What else is there? At Pulkovo, at Vnukovo, and other airfields of the Russian Federation that they use. And right now, Russians are in the high vacation season. They're dragging their behinds to go relax somewhere by the sea, wherever they're still allowed to go. Or at least, if they're not allowed in, then where do they fly? That's right, to Sochi. And this strike in Sochi, which happened just yesterday, led to what Petro Andriushchenko, the head of the Center for the Study of Occupation, is writing about. Let me first show you, just for visualization, this beautiful image from our General Staff, who wrote about the strike on the fuel and lubricants depot at the Sochi airfield, the Sochi airport. So Petro Andriushchenko notes what problems the occupiers are actually facing. He calls it an aviation disaster caused by cotton. First of all, after the ignition of this fuel and lubricant storage tank belonging to the Russians, almost 2,000 square meters, a fire broke out. More than 100 rescuers worked for several hours to extinguish it. Some Sochi flights can no longer operate without refueling at alternate airfields because there isn't enough fuel. For example, Ural Airlines used to fly to St. Petersburg, Domodedovo, and Perm with a refueling stop. Aeroflot also flew this way via Mineralny Vody. All their flights go to Sheremetyevo. The airline Rossiya, a civil aviation company, is changing its routes to St. Petersburg, and the airline Pobeda has also altered its routes. Overall, the Sochi airport itself temporarily restricted the acceptance of aircraft. I don't know what the situation is as of today, but it was no more than 5 flights per hour. They were receiving that number of flights per hour throughout yesterday. All of this is the destruction of civilian infrastructure, including what I would call civil military or even military civilian infrastructure, and the creation of pressure points for the enemy who must feel that the war is spreading. In this way, our forces are raising a very serious issue. They are spreading the war onto Russian territory and making Russians, those who are comfortable, those whose backsides aren't burning, understand that war is a terrible thing that needs to be ended, and preferably ended as soon as possible on the terms of a just peace. This is what it's primarily about right now. Let's move on to the front line. Let's talk about what's happening here. I'll start today's overview with Mr. Kharkiv. Yes, Kharkiv, because yesterday several events concerned the Kharkiv region, not so much the city itself, but the Kharkiv region. Well, first of all, the Russians claimed that they had taken the Hoptivka checkpoint. In Hoptivka, there really was objective control data that made it possible to assert that they, the Russians, were waving their fresh tricolor flags in that area. Hoptivka is one of the former checkpoints through which Kharkiv residents could travel to the Belgorod region. Now, that's definitely no longer relevant. And Hoptivka is actually the fastest route to Kharkiv. As they say, this has already happened before. It was through these areas, from the direction of Kozacha Lopan, that the Russians entered towards Kharkiv. Well, more precisely, they approached Kharkiv, but they didn't actually enter the city. They were closing in on Kharkiv at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Now, the Russians have claimed that supposedly they haven't taken Hoptivka. However, this does not correspond to reality. According to our official sources, in particular, I'll refer to the head of the Derhachi City Military Administration who reports this. His name is Yaroslav, I believe, Yaroslav Zadorenko, the head of the Derhachi Regional Military Administration. According to him, the village has remained under Ukrainian control and still is. Well, there are different things to consider here. One issue is Hoptivka as a village, and another is the Hoptivka checkpoint right here on the border, where in fact the Russians were waving their tricolor flags. However, according to Zadorenko, over the past day, soldiers of the 58th Separate Mechanized Brigade in this direction eliminated more than 10 invaders, while another 10 fled back to Russia after this enemy attack was repelled. I actually want to say that this tactic of stretching our forces in the Kharkiv region by the Russian occupiers constantly, well, in fact, shows that they are trying to advance wherever they have at least some success. So they are constantly looking for points where they can stretch our forces, and they keep trying to attack and advance wherever they have at least some success. Right now, I just want to remind you of the chronology in the Kharkiv region that has taken place over the last 2 years. Well, a year and a half, okay, years. First, a year and 2 months ago, there were Russian breakthroughs in the Liptsi and Vovchansk directions, where they tried to break through to positions from which they could shell Kharkiv, but they failed. In other words, they were blocked here, and in fact, at that time, a serious operation arose, and the armed forces of Ukraine faced serious problems when they had to form the defense on the fly, literally from scratch, in the same 57th Mechanized Brigade, the same 92nd Assault Brigade, and the same 13th National Guard Brigade, Kartia, where in reality, they rushed into unprepared positions and managed to stop, truly heroically stop, the enemy's breakthrough. Subsequently, after the start of even the Kursk operation, the defense forces had enough time to prepare these defensive lines. So essentially, what do we have to observe right now? By the way, I've already mentioned the 57th and 92nd Brigades. Yesterday, President Zelensky visited them along with his office. I'm not just talking about Yermak, but also about the military head of the office, Pavlo Polisu, whom they visited in Kharkiv, where they spoke with the commanders of the 57th and 92nd Brigades. And what's most interesting is that the president reported that they were actually, well, almost on the front line. Of course, it wasn't exactly 0-0, but it was quite close. At the command and observation post of one of the battalions specifically on the Kharkiv axis, namely in Vovchansk and Lipets. The top leadership of our country went there and wasn't afraid to go to the front line, because these manipulations often appear as if they're afraid to go there. To Zelensky's credit, I've never been an open supporter of his, but to his credit, he has a fairly high level of courage to go to the front and meet the soldiers face to face. And this happened right here in these directions, Vovchansk and Lipets. After the Russians were blocked here, there was an opportunity to prepare for further defense in this direction. Meanwhile, the Russians were striking in another direction. They were pushing right here at the junction of Kupyansk and Borova toward the settlements of Krugliakovka and Zagrisovo, with the aim of trying to cross the Oskil River at Sinkivka and move to the right bank of the Oskil in order to carry out an operation against Kupyansk and Kupyansk Uzlovi. They did not succeed. They were blocked here. After that, there were attempts to break through near Dvorishna, and in fact, these attempts were relatively successful. Unfortunately, the enemy managed to establish bridgeheads, but they were not able to move equipment across. Currently, only infantry bridgeheads exist here on the right bank of the Oskil. After that, there were also attempts to break through the cordon in the Strivka area, which were relatively successful. And Milovoye, and these are literally episodes from very recent times when in Milovoye, in the direction of our state border to the north, essentially to the east of Kharkiv, the Russians also occupied the border strip in order to create so-called buffer zones. So why is the enemy creating all these points of tension? I doubt that he would probably like to unite all of them into one and create a single continuous broken front line. But that is an extremely difficult task for them. Most likely, right now, they are diverting the main attention of our troops in this direction, away from Kupyansk and Kupyansk-Uzlovoy, because for the enemy, it is critically important. I have always said this and will continue to repeat it, that Kupyansk is their number 2 priority target after Donbas. And Kupyansk is important to them, and even Kupyansk-Uzlovoy may be even more important, because this is about logistics, about effectively supplying their units by rail. And this is about the railway logistics, which is the backbone of the Russian Federation. By the way, the railway that was attacked once again last night in the Vologda region. This is probably the 12th or 13th episode of attacks on railway stations in the Vologda and Rostov regions, as well as the Krasnodar territory in just the last 2 weeks. This is about logistics and about creating the maximum number of problems for the enemy. But it should be noted that despite all this description of the situation and the fact that the enemy is being blocked in all possible directions, it should be noted that the situation around Kupyansk is still extremely difficult for us, and it is described as such, extremely difficult, by military analyst Konstantin Mashovets. He says that right now the occupiers are trying to expand from Radkivka towards Mirn and from Radkivka towards Kovalevka. And what does this actually mean? It means an advance aimed at blocking our logistical routes that go from Kupyansk to the west towards Kharkiv itself, that is, towards this main road. The Russians are moving in this direction. And especially if they physically move here, then we clearly understand that this is about a complete blockade of one of the important logistical routes from Kupyansk in this direction. And this is by no means an optimal situation, not the best option, not the best scenario for how things could develop. but in a broader sense, there are no breakthroughs happening. And this is the main thing that the defense forces are able to ensure in this particular direction. The absence of breakthroughs is already an achievement, but I'm not a propagandist. I will speak objectively. There are indeed trends toward a worsening situation, particularly in the Kupyansk area. In the same way, on the Kupyansk-Liman axis, we are observing trends toward further deterioration in the direction of Liman. What's the issue? There is a settlement called Torske. It is located on the left bank of the Serebryanka river. Here you can see where Torske is. It is currently marked as part of the gray zone. Recently, in the area around Torske, the Russians managed to advance south of the road that runs from Crimea to Liman. They managed to gain a foothold, in particular in the northern and central parts of Torske. And our troops are gradually retreating. Although the soldiers of the same 63rd Mechanized Brigade who are defending here and whose drone systems battalion is among the best, one of the best in July, are holding out, the enemy is still pressing our positions here and advancing in the Liman direction. And the advance here puts pressure on the area of the Serebryansky forestry and on our defenses because it looms over them. And if we start having problems in Siversk, then issues in the Serebryansky forestry will create problems for Siversk as well. So it's a domino situation here where one event leads to another. And this should also be noted. There is a general trend of the situation worsening for us in the Liman direction. The occupiers understand this. That is precisely why they have recently intensified their offensives towards Siversk. Specifically, this is happening along roughly three directions: Viemka, Verkhnyo-Kamianske, and the area from Bilohorivka and Rihorivka towards Serebryanka. All three of these directions are active here. The 81st Brigade at the very northernmost point near Serebryanka is showing videos where the occupiers, using a line of vehicles, it's surprising, but in reality it's very difficult. In the Siversk direction, the occupier keeps pushing further and further, absolutely without any results, yet for some reason continues to press here specifically with vehicles. In particular, in this attack, there's a video just over 2 minutes long from the Slobozhanska 81st Airmobile Brigade, who are great friends of mine. You can see the destruction of one enemy tank, one IFV, and more than 10 motorcyclists who were attacking our positions. By the way, motorcycle attacks were also recorded yesterday in the area of responsibility, in the sector held by the Kartia Brigade of the National Guard. That's further north, in northern Kharkiv region, where our Kartia fighters from the National Guard of Ukraine also repelled this attack. Let's move down from the Liman front area to first Kupyansk, then Kostiantynivka. So got Kupyansk, Pokrovsk. Well, there's nothing to add about Pokrovsk. The situation is extremely critical, and for some reason I believe there's a trend toward a certain story, which I want to talk about now, that will mark a further deterioration of the situation here. What is this story about? I think that soon the Russians will try to strike the Pokrovsk area as much as possible using Shaheds, including rocket-propelled ones, and possibly in the future Mirnohrad as well. Why do I draw such conclusions? Because recently satellite images like these appeared from the OSINT community Cyberboroshno, showing the Donetsk airfield. At the Donetsk Airport, the Russians are setting up positions for launching Shaheds. In particular, this refers to the preparation of infrastructure for launching jet-modified Shaheds. Here we can see on the territory of the Donetsk Airport that enclosed storage areas for UAVs are being constructed, manual control points are being prepared, locations for unloading warheads, entry positions, air observation posts, and the runway is being repaired after the battles at the airport. Right now, all this infrastructure is being prepared to set up and launch Shaheds from Donetsk. It might seem odd. Why launch Shaheds from Donetsk so close to the front? Because it's much easier for bombs, missiles, or something else to hit there. I have my own theory as to why the occupiers are doing this. First of all, this theory is that launching jet drones from Donetsk, well, it's important to understand that jet drones compared to classic Shaheds are more limited in range and distance. That's why perhaps the occupiers are trying to move this launch Shahed infrastructure closer to some frontline areas so they can strike deeper into Ukrainian territory from Russian-controlled areas. Maybe that's exactly why they're creating it. However, I have another theory. We know that Shaheds are sometimes launched with surveillance cameras. That is, a camera that allows them to home in on a target. And it's clear that the signals from these cameras can't cover a long distance. It's actually quite limited in its range, I don't know. Is it 100, 150, or up to 200 kilometers? And perhaps that's exactly why there's a priority to place such launch sites in Donetsk, so that from the Donetsk area they can control flights within 100 or 150 kilometers along the frontline zones. Those are my theories. I don't know why that is, and I'm not sure if it's true to be precise, but I associate the development of such infrastructure specifically in Donetsk with potential future tensions for us on the front line. As if the Russian Rubicon, which is laying fiber optic cables to Pokrovsk, wasn't enough for us, there could also be additional Shaheds appearing. And finally, today I want to talk about the situation in the Kostiantynivka direction. To the southwest of Kostiantynivka, the Russians have essentially taken and entrenched themselves in Popovy Yar, and in Rusiny Yar they have advanced, creating gray zones here, and fighting continues. The settlement has not yet been captured, but the trend is moving toward deterioration, let's put it that way. Yablonivka is here, another settlement, and Oleksandro Kalinove. By their nature, these are essentially vast gray zones, and it's hard to speak of any real control, any physical control by our troops over these areas. But there's also no physical control by the enemy. In other words, it's a large gray zone. And recently, it's worth noting that the Russians have advanced both in Torske, in the Shcherbinivka area, and in the Dilivka area. So we're seeing total continuous pressure in the Kostiantynivka direction. And unfortunately, it should be noted in conclusion that for now, there are no prospects for improvement in the situation here, just as there are no prospects for improvement near Pokrovsk either. I try to objectively cover everything we have so that we can understand the dangers, so that if these dangers do materialize, they won't come as an extremely cold shower for our society. Because unity, resilience, and a cool head in our society are very important components of our continued resistance. That's why I ask you, friends, to maintain this unity, composure, and resilience. Thank you. All the best, and until we meet again.